My name is Leslie Lomas, and I'm interviewing Carla Selby, and we're going to be talking about her work at KGNU Radio. And today, we think, is August 28th, 2012. Okay. This interview is being recorded for the Maria Rogers Oral History Program, and this interview is being filmed by Anne-Marie Poise. So, Carla, how did you first hear about or get involved with the project to start a non-commercial radio station?
Well, I came back from California from graduate school in 1971 and had a couple of jobs, various jobs, and by 1973 I was looking for something interesting to get involved with. I really don't like to not have something interesting to do after work. So I picked up a free school catalog, and in there was a class entitled A Desperate Attempt to Start a Radio Station. Its first class met on September 13th, 1973, I believe that's correct, and the teacher was a man named Steve Elliott, and I showed up for the class. I don't remember what time it was. It must have been 7:30, 8 o'clock in the evenings, and it was going to meet weekly. And it cost $25. Everybody chipped in $25 to defray the expenses of whatever it would take to make a radio station.
Do you remember how many people approximately were in the class?
I was thinking it was 40. We met in the basement, in a basement room of the free school, which was at the Highland School, which is now the Highland Building, but it's still there, beautiful building, historically building. We went in the basement, and that room was jam-packed full. Nobody could sit down. I don't know that Steve Elliott had any idea that he was going to be that popular. His idea was going to be that popular. It was very popular. And I remember everybody standing cheek by jowl. We couldn't sit, all jammed in together, and trying to remember to raise our hands when we needed to speak. But, you know, we were a bunch of hippies. What the heck? We weren't used to raising our hands before we talked.
And do you know anything, as far as the context of the time goes, as far as public radio goes, and what the radio context was in Boulder? Did NPR exist at the time?
NPR did exist. The All Things Considered was on, but it was pretty rudimentary, and it's come a long way ever since. It maybe had been on the air maybe a year. I'm guessing. I don't know for sure,
Yeah.
but, you know, approximately. But it did exist, and there was another thing called PBS. Oh, God, what was that? Something public broadcasting, PBS.
Yeah, public broadcasting.
Public broadcasting system.
It's which is mainly the TV.
Now is the TV, and it would give you money, but only after if you'd been on the air for 2 years, 3 years, something like that. So we knew we couldn't get any money from them. There were several associations of community broadcasting and educational broadcasting. I went to one meeting, at least in Las Vegas, to see if the National Association of Community Broadcasters, that was one group, and there was another which was maybe just Education Broadcasters of America. I don't remember the exact name, but I'm pretty sure about the National Association of Community Broadcasters. I'm pretty sure about that one.
Just to get back to the free school, so
yeah.
What were all the different aspects that had to be dealt with in order to start a radio station, and how did that get divvied up, and so what did you get involved with?
Well, we had to have a 501c3, we had to be a nonprofit. We had to find a transmitter, we had to find a studio, we had to train and hire a staff, or hire and train a staff, and those are the major things that come to me. I don't know, am I leaving anything out? So the first thing I remember doing for sure was starting to write a 501c3 application to the IRS for the nonprofit educational corporation. We knew we needed that. And that application should still be in the file somewhere at KGNU. We got an EIN number, and a woman named Susan Chazelle, who married Bal Patterson a year or so later, she helped out with that. Because that was really a mammoth thing. There was no doing things online. There was no online. There was no downloading applications. That really took a lot of money, and we knew we had to do it ourselves because even at that time it was going to cost a couple $1,000 to do it together. So we knew we had to do it ourselves. We didn't have that much money.
Just for starting
Just
the 501c3?
for the 501c3, yeah. That's what it would cost. And a lawyer would charge us that, so we just charged right on in and started writing.
And then how long did it take? And then you got the 501c3 status so that you're an official nonprofit corporation.
Right, we were a nonprofit, and that allowed us to look for grants and to call ourselves an educational organization, which was important. And let's see, it must have taken us a good couple of months probably just to write it. It was complicated, and we all had day jobs. And then it famously took 6 months. Now, again, don't quote me, but it took a long darn time to get that thing through the IRS. Now you get it, and in a couple of weeks, I think they approve it. And it's not nearly as hard to get, and it's way less legitimate. When we had to do it, when we were doing it, the IRS, we were told, really looks at it. So you want to be sure you're saying the truth, and you're telling the people who are really involved, and what you really want to do. And we wanted to community broadcast to bring the community together. I don't remember the words on that, but I'm sure that's what it was. And to bring the community together and educate the community, we were going to do educational stuff. We were serious about it. We were definitely, that's what we wanted to do.
And then to form the 501c3, what do you need? You need a board of directors. You need some sort of structure.
Yeah, you had to have a board of directors and a president. And of course, everybody wasn't on that board of directors because we had too many people. Interesting thing was, every time we'd meet, there'd be a few less people. And then finally, there was a hardcore of 15 to 20. And then finally, this is a story for another part of the story here, but finally there were only a couple of us, and we kept it going. But that took a couple of years. A lot of people got discouraged. But at first we needed a board of directors. I'm sure I was on the board of directors because I was writing the 501c3. Now, who would have been? Steve wasn't. He didn't want to be in the limelight, Steve Elliott. He just was a very, very modest person, is a modest person. And he didn't want to be the president, and I don't know who would have. It's possible that Glenn Gerber was the first president, but it should be on the 501c3 application, who was on that board, the whole list. And we called ourselves, this I remember for sure, Boulder Community Broadcast Association, BCBA. And we had the most wonderful logo that the girlfriend of one of the people who was involved designed this logo of people holding hands. I tried to find the logo. I'm sure I have it somewhere. I can't find it, or it's in the files at KGNU. And we didn't have any idea about call letters or any of that. That KGNU thing came up, and it being a GNU. Came up a lot later.
So then you've got some sort of official corporate nonprofit status, and then what are the other things involved, like getting a frequency?
Okay, that was another thing we needed, and we knew a lot. Some people knew a lot. Howard Davidson, Steve Elliott knew a lot about getting a frequency. And shall I tell the story about my father and the frequencies and the state law and,
Sure.
and all of that stuff? My father worked for the Bureau of Standards, and that's why my whole family moved to Boulder in 1954 when the Bureau of Standards, which is now NIST, opened. And my father's work was in radio propagation, frequency standards. And so the state, in order to entice the Bureau of Standards and the government to come and put a big lab, it was big, it had a few hundred employees and big payroll, and it was going to build a huge building, and the citizens of Boulder donated land for that building, in fact. And Boulder wanted that, and the state wanted that to come here to Boulder, that lab. So my dad designed antennas that are still in existence on Table Mountain out by Lyons. You can see them. And so the state passed a law saying that no radio station could interfere with the propagation and attempts at frequency standardization that were emanating from Table Mountain. So that was the state law, and as far as I know, it still is. And so in order to get a transmitter, to find a location for the transmitter, and then to design an antenna took, not just sticking up a wire with a coat hanger on the top of it. You had to have a real transmitting antenna. And then you had to have a decent transmitter that we could have confidence would last a long, long time. And we finally found somebody, I don't know who, somebody gave us a transmitter.
I believe Steve Elliott mentions who
somebody
donated.
Donated the translator, because that was prohibitively expensive. Our total budget was at $25 that everybody had given, and that had got spent on, I don't know, the 501c3. I think there was an application fee, and if we went off to various conferences and stuff, we paid for that ourselves. We went to Las Vegas, forget where else we went, but I definitely went to a couple of places, and Glenn went. And the one I remember is Las Vegas. So anyway, there you have it. That's how we got the transmitter. Somebody donated it. We needed a studio, and we knew we couldn't use the free school. We had an office in the free school. And in order to hire and train staff, we got these things called CETA grants, CETA. Now, I don't remember what that says, or educational something.
Possibly comprehensive
Comprehensive and training, employing,
something.
And I wrote all those grants, but I never got to spend any of the money. And we hired a young lady who was young and willing to do some stuff, and then we had an office in the free school. I think we did not pay for the office. We had to pay her salary, and we had to pay for phones. We had to have a couple of lines. There was big discussions about how many phones and how many lines and what the number. We still have the same number, 449-4885. I remember that from then, and so we couldn't have gotten that number until after we knew what our frequency was going to be. Do you want to hear the story about the frequency?
Yes, so how did you get the frequency?
The U.S. government set aside at the very ends of the radio broadcast spectrum, they set aside 2 or 3 frequencies at each end. And at the time that the Bureau of Standards decided to come here, there were 1 or 2 stations, 1 or 2 in Denver, and maybe 1 in Boulder. KBOL was here in Boulder, and Bob Wilkinson had KRNW, I think, but that was the low frequency broadcast.
Now, those were commercial
Those
stations,
were commercial,
so,
that's exactly right. And so in order to get the frequency, there was only one available, 88.5, and it belonged to CU. CU had, now it didn't own it, but it had a Dibbies on it. It had a reservation on it. So
in other words, was it the FCC?
Yeah.
Would they exist at the time?
Yeah, oh yeah, definitely.
So they would assign the frequencies.
That's right, and we had to ask the FCC, Federal Communications Commission, if we could have this frequency. And then it turned out that CU had it, and it was the only available educational nonprofit frequency. If we wanted to go for commercial in the middle of the dial, but you know, we knew we couldn't afford that. We didn't have the transmitter, and you know, couldn't pay for the electricity for it and all that stuff. So I went, and I believe it was Steve Elliott who went with me to see Mary Frances Berry, who was at the time the Chancellor of CU. And we had asked the Board of Regents if we could have the frequency, and we had asked other people. And Mary Frances Berry was new in the office. And we went up to see her, and she instantly recognizable, you know, a wonderful, liberal, intelligent, highly intelligent, educated person. And she said, "Of course you can have it. You know, we're not going to use it. Why are we sitting on it? Like chickens on an egg that won't hatch. You know, this is silly. Of course you can have it." We didn't have to argue. We didn't have to beg and plead. We didn't have to scheme and plot. She just said yes. That's my recollection. So we had a frequency. We were in the process of getting a transmitter. We had an office, but we didn't have a studio. So I think, I was not part of this. And this was a good 3 years into the process by now. We had our 501c3 and everything. We went to what was then the Hilton Harvest House, which is now the Millennium Hotel.
What's the location?
It's on 28th Street, just in Arapahoe, 28th and Arapahoe. Nice hotel. At that time it was practically the only hotel in town. So we went to them, and somebody talked, probably Glenn, I think, talked them into giving us a studio, which turned out to be a motel room right on the creek, which was great because there was a front living room, and then there were 2 smaller bedrooms. This is what the motel would have been, and a bathroom. And that was fine. And there was some closet or something that was the news booth, the newsroom booth. We had a news booth. No, we really felt like big time. And there was kind of like a green room. There was a front office, and then there was a green room where the talent would come and comb their hair and sit around and talk. And then there was another room I remember behind, and I guess it must have been library or something. We had a huge collection of records, of 78 records. And so probably they were in there, and I don't remember. There was only one, I'm pretty sure of this, there was only one broadcast place, and that was that broadcast booth, and they kept calling it the news booth. So, you know, we knew who had priority on it. So
but there was just one room that was used as the broadcast studio.
Yeah. But it was really tiny. It had been, I think, a walk-in closet or something. And remember a man named John Lauer, who owned a facility called Colorado Computing, gave us some acoustic tile. He treated those tile like they were his baby. And, you know, we had to put them up with special glue, and we had to take really good care of them. But they were in that broadcast booth, and as far as I know, they took pretty good care.
And there also then had to be broadcast equipment, had to be a soundboard and microphones and
whatever. That's right. And there was a big table. I remember a big table, and I would sit on one side. I was the science broadcaster. I did the science, and I would get people to come in. I got David Hawkins in. I got this guy who did the thing about asbestos, the scientist from NCAR. God, I can't remember his name. Should have looked all that up.
But we'll talk about
we can
your
talk
programming.
About that later. But that's what the configuration was. I remember 2 rooms, and where the talent would sit, there was a big couch, and there was the big front office with the phones and all of that stuff, and then there was this I guess it was a large closet, but it was a small broadcast booth, and there were other microphones, and we had tape recorders. We'd go out and carry tape recorders and stuff.
So and somehow that the money for getting that equipment had to be raised from somewhere.
Yeah, we got grants at that point. We got some grants. And I believe that I wrote some of them, but I don't remember exactly. I remember writing the CETA grants to get the staff, And CETA's now defunct, so I don't know how we got those for 3-4 years anyway, and had 3 or 4 people. Because we hired staff to run the station on those CETA grants, I'm pretty sure. And where else we got grants, I do not remember. But you're right, we had to get them.
Yeah. And so somehow it all came together, and KGNU actually managed to go on the air. And when was that?
Geez,
78?
78. It was sometime in 78, but I'm sure somebody else will remember. We put out a broadcast, a little booklet with the program in it, a program guide. We put that out at the very first, because we knew we had to get the word out. That was one of the things we talked about. Oh, David McIntosh was instrumental in getting grants and doing the program guide, I'm pretty sure. I did the photographs of the talent in that. I remember Hot Rise was one of the first groups that we had that performed. And Fergus, I think, Fergus Stone must have known the Hot Rise people. And I don't remember their names, but I might recognize them if somebody said them. So by that time we were in the motel rooms, and one year, the year of the flood, we hadn't been in that motel room very long, let's say 6 months, and it was a spring, and Boulder had a flood. What we would do for that much water right at the moment. But we had a flood, and we were standing there on the bank, and the motel wasn't 20 feet away from the bank of the stream there, and we were watching it rising, and you could watch it, 15 minutes later, and there was a tree trunk covered, and 15 minutes later it was halfway up the trunk, and it was really scary. So I was ready to go get my pickup truck and try to save. We had to save what we could. I mean, my God, that was hard-won stuff. And it finally just reached a plateau and then wasn't rising anymore. Didn't come over the banks at that point. So we were okay, but that was very scary. And that was not long after we went on air.
79. Maybe.
I think, I'll bet you that was like 78.
Oh, really?
I'm sure that there's somewhere in the records when that flood was, this spring. That Boulder flood.
Right, and the little structure that the hotel had donated for KGNU's use was right near the banks of Boulder Creek.
It wasn't 20 feet away.
Yeah.
I mean, it was a great place for a motel room. You sit there out there, and there's a little concrete pad right in front. Put your chair there and watch the creek run by. It was great, but it wasn't supposed to flood.
Right.
So what the heck?
And so when KGNU finally went on the air, and then what was your involvement? You mentioned some science programming.
Yeah, I was the
first. Do you remember how was the programming discussed? Were you involved in those discussions?
No, I just said I'm going to do science programming. I'm going to do once a week, and I was going to do it live. And then I decided not to do it live, not every time, because there were some things I wanted to do and people I wanted to interview. And so Fergus was my engineer. And he and I went up, I remember, to NCAR and talked to this guy who figured out that tobacco was radioactive, and that's what was causing, that's what it was. I wish I could remember his name. Scientist, did very meticulous work, very controversial. Of course, the tobacco companies did not want him to be right. And he demonstrated that tobacco leaves being broad would attract radioactivity from the ground, and the ground is indeed radioactive. So when the tobacco leaves were minimally processed, as they were for cigarettes, and made into cigarettes, you were getting radioactivity into your lungs, which was at least a contributing factor to getting lung cancer. And that was just when all this thing about cigarettes were really bad for you. But for some reason, he was very controversial, and I suspect it was because the two cigarette companies didn't want him to be right. And that was when Rocky Flats and the radioactivity business with Rocky Flats, so everybody was very aware of our local radioactivity problems. And we wanted to help that out. So that was not just a science, but it also sort of had a political slant to it. I remember we went up to NCAR and that beautiful building, and went up there and interviewed him, and then had interviews with several other people, and it was a real chore. Fergus had to cut that into, we must have had 2 hours of tape. He had to cut that into a half-hour show. And so we figured out pretty quick that when you do it live, you don't have to worry about that. Just make a bunch of good questions and ask people. I interviewed David Hawkins about the philosophy and history of science. I interviewed this guy who wrote The Health Hazards of Not Going Nuclear. In other words, his contention, he was a professor at CU, was his contention that people died more from cold than they died from radioactivity from nuclear energy and nuclear plants. He wasn't right, but that was what his book was about. Teller, was that his last name? Was maybe Teller? No. It'll come to me in the middle of the night. But anyway, he wrote this book, and we interviewed him, and I deliberately set out to try and trip him up, because I knew he wasn't right. I couldn't do it. He knew what he was talking about. He had the facts, and I had read one or two things, but I wasn't experienced enough to really make him eat his words. And he stuck to his guns.
Well, I believe that argument is still current.
Well, it's still current.
30 years later.
A lot more people are dying. Well, those coal miners, they're ruining their health, ruining the environment. I got no use for coal mining. But in the context of that thing, that particular interview, and I'm sorry I don't remember any of the others, but I must have done that for 6 months. Just after we went to, and the other thing that I did was I was a classical music programmer. And I remember that Steve Elliott and I went down to see KVOD, which was in Denver on the top of Floyd Hill, because they played classical music. And I just wanted to see, how did they classify the classical music? It's not that easy to do. It's not that obvious. You know, if you have a record that's all Mozart, it goes under Mozart. But if you've got one that's got Mozart and Beethoven and Brahms, then what do you do with it? So we figured out a way to classify those, and I remember they were in a big drawer, and then they went to a shelf, and eventually we got all the KVOD 33s. We had some of those, and we also had KBOL, was broadcasting KBVL on FM, and was broadcasting classical music, and then they decided it was a bad idea, so we got there. We have quite a good selection of 33s, classical 33s, at the station right now, I think. And their idea of using those records is very different from mine. I was pretty standard. I just played the good old classic things, but that's what I did, and we classified. And I still hung around the station and did things, you know, answered the phone.
You have a picture, I believe, of yourself at the...
That's a picture of me. You can see the inbox, and you can see it says KGNU there. I think, you know what, I have an idea, although don't quote me, that this picture was maybe taken by the Colorado Daily. That's possible. It doesn't say on the back who actually took it. And so I was answering the phones, and this may have been the time when we were having that problem with that we were well on the air, and I'm virtually certain that we were still in the motel. And we had this terrible problem, because once we went on the air, we were on 88.5, and Channel 6's audio was on 88.0. And that, we got really, really angry. People loved Channel 6. That was, you know, the very beginning of educational, so-called educational broadcasting.
And what was happening that the broadcasts from KGNU were coming across the audio of Channel 6 TV programs.
That's exactly what it was. You were listening to a TV program, and all of a sudden you were hearing some music or some talk or something. And the reason, because the frequency were so close, and KGNU had a hefty signal, and the audio signal for Channel 6 wasn't that good. So we tried to figure out how to get them to relocate, and we negotiated and we talked, and people would just call up and scream. And my job, and I think I did it rather well, I was proud of myself, my job was to calm people down and say, yes, I agree, it's really terrible. I would be very upset if I couldn't listen to Channel 6. I love Channel 6. And, you know, and we have this solution, this filter that we made. Howard Davidson, I think, came up with the idea, and Bob Wilkinson probably helped him, to come up with a filter that would filter out KGNU, and you were supposed to put it on your antenna at the back of, and this was with rabbit ears antennas. There wasn't even any cable. And so you put that on the back of, on your antenna. It was supposed to filter out the KGNU. And I guess, you know, people were just furious, and I really would. I was very good at it, calming down and making nice. And so we did it, but eventually we just had to knock our power down. And it really wasn't our fault.
The ultimate resolution.
The ultimate resolution. It really wasn't our fault. It was that Channel 6 had a very sloppy signal, and should have been broadcasting, and their bandwidth was way too wide, and their frequency was floppy, with too much frequency, and it was their fault. But you know, they were big. They were very big then, and they'd been around for a while, and everybody loved them. And we were new, and we were a bunch of hippies, and a bunch of Boulder hippies. And what were we doing? Interfering with Channel 6. I just was not acceptable.
Well, was it also a problem that the FCC had allowed two frequencies that were just too close together?
Yeah, and the FCC shouldn't have done that. But, you know, there was supposed to be a very tight frequency that Channel 6 broadcast on, and what the problem was, I think, was the antennae were not discriminatory enough. So they just picked up a whole lot of frequency, and when you tuned your tuner on your TV set, it picked up too broad a frequency spectrum. I think that's what the problem was, so that you had to redesign the antennas or redesign the switches to get from one channel to the other, and it was, they really could hear us. There was no doubt about it, and they didn't want to hear us, and eventually it got resolved, and I think there was a resolution eventually, and it probably took 3-4 months anyway to knock back the power for KGNU.
So the FCC directed KGNU to pull back
I believe so. Yeah, I believe
and so. And I believe then that did that limit the geographic area in which KGNU could be received?
Because now KGNU, as I understand it, broadcasts in Denver, and is very well received, but it has to have a separate frequency, so there's a translator. And that can be all very focused and all very narrowed, and you know, there's no problem. So yeah, people wanted us to broadcast in Denver. There were a lot of hippies in Denver who wanted to hear us, and we just couldn't do that. The situation is way different now, what with cable and all of that.
Yeah, and then so about how long were you involved with the station after it went on the air, and then?
Not that long. Okay, it was started in '73 and it went on in '78, and most of that time was getting 501c3 and raising money, finding, you know, that whole 9 yards. When it finally went on, and I was doing a classical music broadcast, and a really not nice thing happened. I was told I was in the middle of my show, which was 2 hours. Some night, Tuesday night, Wednesday night, whatever it was, and I was all programmed and I had my stack of records ready to go. And somebody, I think was either the acting station manager or something, and I think I won't name names, but he called me up and said, Tim Lenk has a program and he wants to broadcast it, and you have to get off the air right now. And I was furious, so I waited till I didn't want to leave dead air. I waited till Tim Lenk showed up, and he did his broadcast, and that was the last time I went on air. I was really mad at that. I don't want to mince words, but that wasn't fair. Tim Lang.
Because normally how would programming have been decided at the time?
Programming, I was assigned, that was my time. Let's say Tuesday night from 7 to 9, I think, or 8 to 10 or whatever. Every Tuesday night I played my selection of classical music and talked about it as I chose. I would get classical people to come in and talk about the music or about what they were doing or whatever, and I considered it a real service to the classical music community. And then to be bumped off unceremoniously, I was at least halfway through my show. I thought that was not right and not fair. And so I remember the man's name, Tim Link, and he's still around, I think, and I don't know that it was his problem. It was the problem of the person who was in charge, who unceremoniously kicked me off in the middle of my show. I was not happy.
Tim has actually recently, or within a year or so, has recently moved from Boulder. I guess that's,
okay.
But beside the point. Okay, so that was kind of covers my questions about your experience in helping KGNU get on the air. So it was a good 5 years that it took. From when the free school class to actually getting the station on the air.
And it was bumpy. It was bumpy. And the two specific things that, in terms of the organization and its evolution, and one was that there was a kind of a core of people, and Glenn was definitely one of them, Glenn Gerberg, who was the first station manager. He loved it. He kept going and was the leader that we more or less all acknowledged, that he was the leader. But a lot of people kept peeling off, going away. As I say, we started out that one day with the 40 people in that classroom, and at one point, Glenn went to the University of Florida to get a degree in broadcasting, but he ended up being a weatherman. That was his career after a while. And he went to the University of Florida, and I was the only one who was still trying to get, really, I was the only one. I knew everybody. I knew who had peeled off. I knew who to try and call. And the only person I could get a hold of was Howard Davidson. I can't tell you when this was, but and I even called Glenn long distance, and I said, Glenn, I'm the only one here. What's happening with KGNU? And I remember that Glenn said, don't worry, I'll come back. I'll finish my degree and I'll come back. And he did, and he got the station going. So, that's good, but, it really kind of, as I say, there were lumps and bumps in the road and tough times and all that stuff. But we'd done too much work, we'd gone too far, and by the time we finally got on the air, Fergus was there, but he hadn't started at the very beginning. I think maybe Glenn, me, Steve backed out. Steve never wanted to be on the air. He just got us going. That was his thing. And to get us up and running, which he did. And Steve was gone. And Bob Wilkinson was gone. And Fergus was still there, I think. And he had been my engineer, and then he stayed on, and what capacity, I don't remember. But then Glenn came back, and things got up and running, and then we got people, because everybody wanted to be on the radio. That was when it was still a good thing to be on the radio.
And Glenn was the first station manager?
I'm virtually certain. I'm virtually certain.
I think too.
Yeah.
And I believe am I remembering correctly that he passed away?
Yeah, within the last year.
Oh,
I saw him. I saw him a couple of years ago.
Unfortunately, before being interviewed.
Yeah,
about
unfortunately, because he would have lots of stories to tell, and they may or may not have comported with what I'm saying. He may have an entirely different picture. He'll remember that little girl who wanted to smoke in our office. She was the first CETA person we hired. And that was at the Free School. He would have remembered her. There was a nice obituary about him just after he died, so you can at least get some, and definitely mentions. Yeah, he was a very important force. And he was a nice man. But this brings me to the second of these situations. And this was starting in 1973, and I don't want to make too much of it, but it struck me at the time. I just come from graduate school in Berkeley, California, and the free speech movement. And this situation here in Boulder with this radio station was sexist, and there's just no getting around it. I could answer the phone, I could be the secretary of the board, but I couldn't be the vice president or the president or even the treasurer. I could take the notes. I was the typical female job person. I could broadcast classical music. And the reason why I got away with being the science editor, which should have been a man's thing, was because I was the only one in the station. I thought of the idea. I knew all the scientists. I had worked in science. Nobody else knew. A lot of people knew about electricity and engineering and radio stuff. But they didn't know about the broader science, and they didn't have the idea, so I just kind of muscled my way in there. But it definitely was feminist, and there were people who just told me I was a girl and I couldn't do anything. So I got over it.
Right. And you were saying in the context that the feminist movement was just starting to gain attention and to get people thinking about.
Yeah, there was a lot of push for feminism in the late 60s in Berkeley, but that was in Berkeley, and Berkeley always was a little bit avant-garde. And when I came back here, I don't know what I expected, but I did not expect to be treated as a second-class citizen. Mm-hmm. So, and gradually they got over it. And gradually, Marty was the station manager and much beloved, and you know, no doubt about her competence and commitment. But that took a while. I don't have any idea when Marty became, but she was definitely a long-standing.
Right. I think sometime in the late 80s she became news director, and then sometime after that became the station manager, right, for many years before.
But
Sam
we didn't overlap. I of course knew who she was, but we did not overlap. She was never there while I was there, nor was I there while David Barsamian was there. He was totally new. We know each other. We smile politely and say hello, and I love what he's doing. He's, you know, he tells the truth, and man, that is just so so precious. Yeah. But I don't really know him, and he, you know, we sort of know who each other is. But that was something that, for this feminism, it was sort of on my shoulders. There were another couple of women there who also knew their place and had no expectations, and I had hopes. And I tried to live up to them, and I think all the men eventually came around.
And did you ever think that KGNU would actually make it for another 30 years or so and become a significant cultural institution of Boulder?
I am very proud of the work that we did. I cannot say me. I did. Yeah, I was a moving force there, but I wasn't the only one by any means, and I'm very proud of that KGNU is there. It's unique on the broadcast band throughout the country as far as I know, and a lot of people listen to it. People compliment KGNU on being so unique. Sorry for the bad grammar. And yeah, I'm very, very pleased with spending that time. I think it was time well spent. It didn't turn out to be the way I thought it would be, but it did turn out to be a very good, very Boulder thing.
Well, thank you very much, Carla Selby.
You're very welcome, Leslie. I hope that will elucidate an important aspect of our development of our community. I hope.